Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Maybe you've had a long day, or perhaps you simply need to let the world fade away for a while. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter, more at ease. Tonight we drift to the bottom of the world, to Antarctica, the frozen continent at the end of the Earth. A place of endless ice, profound silence, and human determination stretched to its absolute limits. We're going to explore Operation Deep Freeze, one of the most ambitious undertakings in the history of human exploration. The construction of the first permanent bases in Antarctica, where men lived through months of darkness and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. Where the wind howled across ice sheets miles thick, and the nearest help was thousands of miles away across the most violent ocean on Earth. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into history, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin our journey to the ice. Antarctica wasn't always known. For centuries, it existed only in theory, a terra australis incognita, an unknown southern land that cartographers drew on maps simply because they believed it must exist. The ancient Greeks theorized that there had to be a landmass in the south to balance the known lands of the north. They imagined a world of symmetry, where continents mirrored each other across the equator. But it would take until the age of exploration before anyone actually saw this frozen realm. Captain James Cook, the legendary British explorer, crossed the Antarctic Circle in 1773 during his second voyage of discovery. He sailed his ships, the Resolution and Adventure, through treacherous seas filled with towering icebergs and pack ice that threatened to crush wooden hulls. Cook circumnavigated the Antarctic continent, though he never actually sighted the mainland itself. The ice was too thick, the conditions too severe. He came within 75 miles of the coast but was turned back by impenetrable ice fields. Cook wrote in his journal that no one would ever venture farther south than he had gone, and that nothing of value could be found in those frozen wastes. He was wrong on both counts, but his assessment reflected the brutal reality he encountered. The seas around Antarctica were among the most violent on Earth, with waves that could reach heights of 50 feet or more, driven by winds that circled the globe unimpeded by any landmass. It wasn't until 1820 that human eyes confirmed the existence of the Antarctic continent. 3 expeditions, working independently, all claimed to have been the first to sight land. A Russian expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev, sailing the ships Vostok and Mirny, recorded sighting an ice shelf on January 27, 1820. Just days later, British naval officer Edward Bransfield sighted the Antarctic Peninsula. And in November of that same year, American sealer Nathaniel Palmer reported seeing the continent from his small vessel. The race to explore Antarctica had begun, though it would be a slow race, measured in decades rather than years. The continent was simply too hostile, too remote, too dangerous for sustained exploration with the technology of the early 19th century. Captain James Clark Ross, a British naval officer and polar explorer, led one of the most significant early Antarctic expeditions from 1839 to 1843. Ross commanded the ships Erebus and Terror, names that would later be given to the volcano and the island where Operation Deep Freeze would establish its main base more than a century later. Ross discovered the Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, and Ross Island. He sailed farther south than anyone before him, reaching 78 degrees south latitude. Ross encountered an ice barrier that seemed to stretch endlessly to the east and west, a vertical wall of ice rising up to 200 feet above the sea. This was the Ross Ice Shelf, a floating platform of ice roughly the size of France, fed by glacier flowing from the interior of the continent. Ross tried for weeks to find a passage through this barrier but was forced to turn back. The ice was simply impassable for wooden sailing ships. By the turn of the 20th century, Antarctica had become the focus of what historians would call the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. This was an era of remarkable bravery, incredible hardship, and sometimes tragic endings. Explorers from Britain, Norway, Sweden, Germany, France, Belgium, and Japan mounted expeditions to map the continent, reach the South Pole, and conduct scientific research. Robert Falcon Scott, a British Royal Navy officer, led 2 major expeditions to Antarctica. His first expedition from 1901 to 1904 aboard the Discovery made important geographical discoveries and set a new southern record, reaching 82 degrees south. Scott, along with Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, man-hauled sledges across the Ross Ice Shelf in brutal conditions, battling scurvy, frostbite, and near starvation. Scott's second expedition, the Terra Nova expedition from 1910 to 1913, would end in tragedy. Scott and 4 companions reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, only to discover that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had beaten them by 33 days. Exhausted, disappointed, and facing the onset of winter, Scott's party began their return journey. All 5 men died on the Ross Ice Shelf, just 11 miles from a supply depot that might have saved them. Their bodies weren't discovered until November 1912, along with Scott's diary documenting their final days. Roald Amundsen, in contrast, had planned his expedition with meticulous attention to detail. He used sled dogs rather than ponies, wore clothing adapted from Inuit designs rather than British naval uniforms, and established supply depots far in advance of his polar journey. Amundsen and his team reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, planted the Norwegian flag, and returned safely to their base, having covered 1,800 miles in 99 days. It was a masterclass in polar exploration, achieved with minimal fanfare and maximum efficiency. But while Amundsen had conquered the pole, it was an American aviator who would transform Antarctic exploration in ways no one had imagined. His name was Richard Evelyn Byrd, and he would become synonymous with 20th century Antarctic exploration. Richard Byrd was born in 1888 in Winchester, Virginia, into a prominent political family. He joined the U.S. Navy and became a naval aviator, recognizing early that aircraft could revolutionize polar exploration. In 1926, Byrd claimed to have flown over the North Pole, though this claim remains controversial to this day. What is certain is that Byrd turned his attention southward, to Antarctica, where aviation had never been attempted. In 1928, Byrd organized his first Antarctic expedition, bringing 2 aircraft and establishing a base camp he named Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf. This base, Little America 1, was located at approximately 78 degrees south latitude, on the same ice shelf where Scott and his men had perished just 16 years earlier. But Byrd's approach was different. He brought the technology of the modern age to the ice, aircraft, radio communications, motorized vehicles, and prefabricated structures. On November 28 and 29, 1929, Byrd and his crew made the first flight over the South Pole in a Ford trimotor aircraft named the Floyd Bennett. The flight covered 1,600 miles round trip, taking 19 hours. Byrd had to lighten the aircraft by dumping food supplies to gain enough altitude to clear the mountains surrounding the polar plateau. It was a dangerous flight, pushing the limits of both man and machine in temperatures that could reach 60 degrees below zero. But it succeeded, and Byrd returned to the United States as a hero, promoted to Rear Admiral by Congress, and awarded the Medal of Honor. Byrd would return to Antarctica for more times, establishing Little America 2 in 1933, Little America 3 during a secret wartime expedition in 1940, and Little America 4 as part of Operation High Jump in 1946. Each expedition built upon the knowledge gained from previous ventures, and each pushed further into the interior of the continent. Operation High Jump, conducted from 1946 to 1947, was the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted at that time. It was a massive military operation involving 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier and a submarine, along with 33 aircraft and 4,700 men. The official goal was to establish research bases, test equipment in frigid conditions, and train personnel for cold weather operations. But there were also geopolitical motivations. The United States wanted to assert its presence in Antarctica and evaluate the continent's strategic importance as the Cold War began to take shape. High Jump succeeded in mapping large portions of the Antarctic coastline using aerial photography, surveying over 70% of the continent's coast. But the expedition also highlighted the enormous challenges of operating in Antarctica. Aircraft crashed, equipment froze, and several men died in accidents. The operation confirmed what earlier explorers had learned through bitter experience: Antarctica was unforgiving, and success required meticulous planning, specialized equipment, and personnel trained for the harshest environment on Earth. But High Jump was a military operation with limited scientific objectives. What would transform Antarctic exploration from a series of isolated expeditions into sustained international scientific cooperation was the International Geophysical Year, known as the IGY. The idea for the International Geophysical Year began on an April evening in 1950 at the home of Dr. James Van Allen in Silver Spring, Maryland. Van Allen, who would later discover the radiation belts that bear his name, was hosting a small dinner party. Among his guests were Dr. Lloyd Berkner and Dr. Sidney Chapman, two of the most prominent geophysicists of their era. Over dinner and conversation, the topic turned to the international polar years of 1882 to 1883 and 1932 to 1933, coordinated international efforts to study the polar regions and geophysical phenomena. Berkner suggested it was time for another such effort, a third polar year that would take advantage of new technologies developed during and after World War II, rockets that could probe the upper atmosphere, improved radio equipment, radar, and aviation that could reach previously inaccessible regions. Chapman enthusiastically agreed. Both men recognized that many fundamental questions about the Earth remained unanswered. How did the upper atmosphere work? What caused the aurora? How did the Earth's magnetic field behave? What processes drove weather and climate? And what role did the polar regions, particularly Antarctica, play in global systems? The idea caught fire within the scientific community. In 1952, the International Council of Scientific Unions officially announced the International Geophysical Year, scheduled to run from July 1, 1957, to December 31, 1958. This 18-month period was chosen because it coincided with the peak of solar activity in the 11-year solar cycle, offering optimal conditions for studying how the Sun influenced the Earth. The IGY would involve 67 nations and thousands of scientists conducting coordinated research on 14 different scientific disciplines: aurora and airglow, cosmic rays, geomagnetism, glaciology, gravity, ionospheric physics, longitude and latitude determinations, meteorology, oceanography, seismology, solar activity, upper atmosphere physics, Antarctic research, and Arctic research. What made the IGY particularly remarkable was that it transcended the political tensions of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in nuclear competition and ideological struggle, both participated fully in the IGY. Scientists from East and West agreed to share data, coordinate observations, and work toward common scientific goals. It was a rare moment of cooperation in an otherwise divided world. Antarctica became the centerpiece of IGY research. The continent offered unique opportunities to study glaciology, meteorology, upper atmosphere physics, and geomagnetism. Its extreme isolation meant that measurements taken there could provide baseline data uncontaminated by human industrial activity. and the fact that multiple nations would establish permanent research stations across the continent allowed for coordinated observations on a continental scale. The United States committed to establishing multiple permanent bases in Antarctica as its contribution to the IGY. This would require a massive logistical operation, larger even than Operation High Jump, and it would need to succeed in constructing facilities capable of sustaining year-round occupation. The stakes were high. American prestige, scientific leadership, and Cold War positioning all depended on success. This operation was given a code name that reflected both its magnitude and its setting, Operation Deep Freeze. In July 1955, Rear Admiral George J. Dufek was appointed commander of Task Force 43, the naval task force assigned to establish and support American bases in Antarctica. Dufek was an experienced polar aviator who had participated in Operation High Jump nearly a decade earlier. He understood the challenges ahead and the narrow margin for error when operating in Antarctica. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, now in his late 60s, was appointed officer in charge of Operation Deep Freeze, though this was largely an honorary position. Byrd's health was declining, but his presence lent credibility and publicity to the operation. This would be Byrd's fifth and final Antarctic expedition, a symbolic passing of the torch from the era of individual explorers to the age of institutional scientific research. The plan was ambitious: establish 7 permanent bases across Antarctica, each chosen for its scientific value and geographic importance. These bases would need to support year-round occupation, with personnel living through the Antarctic winter, when temperatures could drop to 100 degrees below zero, winds could exceed 100 miles per hour, and the sun didn't rise above the horizon for months at a time. The 7 planned bases were McMurdo Station on Ross Island, Amundsen Scott Station at the South Pole, Byrd Station on the Antarctic Plateau, Little America 5 on the Ross Ice Shelf, Ellsworth Station on the Filchner Ice Shelf, Hallett Station on the coast of Victoria Land, and Wilkes Station on the coast of Wilkes Land. Each location was selected for specific scientific reasons. McMurdo would serve as the main logistics hub, with access to the Ross Sea and proximity to the Transantarctic Mountains. The South Pole Station would allow for studies of geomagnetism, meteorology, and upper atmosphere physics at the axis of the Earth's rotation. Byrd Station would investigate the Antarctic interior and ice cap dynamics. Little America 5 would continue the legacy of Byrd's earlier bases and study the Ross Ice Shelf. Ellsworth Station would explore the Atlantic sector of Antarctica. Hallett Station would provide data from the coast for comparison with interior stations. Wilkes Station would cover the Indian Ocean sector. Together, these stations would create a network spanning the entire continent, allowing for coordinated observations that would provide unprecedented insight into Antarctic science. But establishing these bases presented extraordinary challenges. Antarctica is the most remote continent on Earth, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. The nearest major port, Christchurch, New Zealand, was over 2,500 miles from McMurdo Sound. Ships traveling to Antarctica had to cross the Southern Ocean, notorious for having the most violent seas on the planet. Sailors spoke with dread of the roaring 40s, furious 50s, and screaming 60s latitude bands where wind circled the globe unimpeded by land, building waves into moving mountains of water. Once ships reached Antarctic waters, they encountered pack ice, vast fields of floating ice that could trap and crush vessels. Only specially reinforced icebreakers could force their way through, and even they could be stopped by thick multi-year ice. The construction season was limited to the brief Antarctic summer, from late November to early February, when temperatures might rise above zero and there was 24-hour daylight. But even summer weather was unpredictable, with blizzards that could shut down work for days at a time. Supplies had to be brought from the United States, everything needed to construct and sustain bases in an environment where nothing grew, nothing lived on land, and rescue might be impossible. Thousands of tons of building materials, fuel, food, vehicles, scientific equipment, and personal gear had to be loaded aboard ships, transported across the world's most dangerous ocean, unloaded onto ice or volcanic rock, and assembled in freezing conditions by men working in extreme cold. And then, once the bases were established and the ships departed, small groups of men would be left behind to winter over, isolated from the rest of humanity for 8 months until the next summer when ships could return. They would face months of darkness, temperatures that could kill exposed skin in minutes, and the psychological strain of complete isolation. Radio contact would be their only link to the outside world, and even that was unreliable, subject to atmospheric conditions and equipment failures. The men who volunteered for Operation Deep Freeze knew they were taking on one of the most challenging assignments in the world. But they also knew they were part of something historic, a scientific endeavor that would expand human knowledge and establish a permanent human presence on the last unexplored continent. Task Force 43 was assembled at ports along the east coast and west coast of the United States during the summer and fall of 1955. The task force would include cargo ships, icebreakers, tankers, and various support vessels, each loaded with carefully calculated supplies for establishing the Antarctic bases. The cargo ships USS Wyandotte and USS Arnett were attack cargo ships of the Andromeda class, vessels designed to carry heavy equipment and land it on hostile shores. They were loaded with prefabricated building panels, construction equipment, vehicles, food, fuel drums, and thousands of other items needed for establishing bases. Every cubic foot of cargo space was utilized, with supplies packed according to priority and landing sequence. The icebreakers were the key to reaching the Antarctic coast. 3 icebreakers were assigned to Task Force 43, USS Edisto, USS Glacier, and USCGC East Wind. These vessels had reinforced hulls with thick steel plating designed to withstand the crushing pressure of pack ice. Their bows were shaped to ride up onto ice and break it with the ship's weight. Powerful diesel-electric engines allowed them to back up and ram ice repeatedly, smashing a channel through which other ships could follow. USS Glacier was the most powerful American icebreaker at that time, capable of breaking through ice up to 20 feet thick. Commissioned in 1955, she was specifically designed for Antarctic operations, with a reinforced bow, heated tanks that could flood compartments in the bow to change the ship's trim and improve ice-breaking capability, and accommodations for scientific personnel and equipment. USCGC East Wind was a Wind-class icebreaker operated by the U.S. Coast Guard. These vessels had proven themselves in both Arctic and Antarctic operations, reliable workhorses that could operate independently for extended periods in polar waters. The task force also included USS Nespelun, a gasoline tanker that would transport aviation fuel needed for aircraft operations from the planned air bases. 2 fuel barges, YOG-34 and YOG-70, carried diesel fuel for heating and power generation. USNS Greenville Victory, a Victory-class cargo ship operated by the Military Sea Transportation Service, carried additional supplies. The official emblem for Task Force 43 was designed by none other than Walt Disney. Disney had a long association with polar exploration. He had created animated segments about Antarctica for various projects and was fascinated by the extreme environment. The emblem featured a cartoon penguin standing on an ice floe, holding a ship in one flipper and a plane in the other, with the Task Force 43 designation. Disney was made an honorary member of Task Force 43, though he never actually traveled to Antarctica himself. But his emblem would be worn with pride by the men who did. The personnel for Operation Deep Freeze came primarily from the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, known as the Seabees. The Seabees had been formed during World War II to build airfields, roads, bridges, and bases in combat zones, often under fire. They were skilled construction workers who had joined the Navy's carpenters, electricians, heavy equipment operators, mechanics, welders, and engineers. They knew how to build under difficult conditions, and they were about to face the most difficult conditions on Earth. Approximately 200 Seabees volunteered to be part of the first winter-over cruise, the men who would remain at the bases through the Antarctic winter after the ships departed. These volunteers underwent training at the Naval Construction Battalion Center in Davisville, Rhode Island, where they learned cold-weather survival skills, practiced assembling the prefabricated buildings that would be used in Antarctica, and familiarized themselves with specialized cold-weather equipment. They learned that standard construction techniques didn't work in extreme cold. Metal became brittle and could shatter. Machinery needed to be preheated before starting. Fuel had to be specially formulated to prevent gelling. Lubricants thickened and failed. Batteries lost power rapidly. And working outside in temperatures far below zero required constant vigilance to prevent frostbite. Exposed skin could freeze in less than 60 seconds when the wind was blowing. The Seabees practiced working while wearing heavy cold-weather gear, insulated boots, multiple layers of clothing, thick gloves that made fine manipulation difficult, face masks, and goggles. They learned to pace themselves, because sweating inside their clothing could be deadly. Wet clothing lost its insulating value, and in the extreme cold, that moisture could freeze, creating a layer of ice against the skin. They learned about the psychological challenges of isolation, how the months of darkness could affect mood and mental health, and how crucial it was to maintain routines, stay busy, and support each other. The Antarctic winter could be psychologically crushing, and the Navy wanted men who were mentally resilient as well as physically capable. By late 1955, Task Force 43 was ready. Ships were loaded, crews were trained, and the mission was clear. The first phase of Operation Deep Freeze would focus on establishing McMurdo Station and Little America 5, the two bases on the Ross Ice Shelf. These would serve as the main logistics hubs for subsequent operations to establish bases in the interior and around the continent. The task force departed from U.S. ports in late 1955, with different elements sailing at different times to coordinate arrival in Antarctica. The journey would take them across the Pacific Ocean to New Zealand, where they would stage in Christchurch, the traditional jumping-off point for Antarctic operations. Christchurch sits on the east coast of New Zealand's South Island, at approximately 43 degrees south latitude. It's a temperate city, but its proximity to Antarctica, only about 2,100 miles to the south, has made it the primary gateway for Antarctic operations since the early days of exploration. Scott, Shackleton, and Byrd all staged their expeditions through Christchurch, and in 1955 it once again became a bustling hub of Antarctic activity. The ships of Task Force 43 arrived in Christchurch in late November and early December 1955. Final supplies were loaded, last-minute equipment checks were completed, and personnel prepared mentally for the journey ahead. For most of the sailors and Seabees, this would be their first time venturing into Antarctic waters, and they had heard the stories: ships trapped in ice for months, waves that could sweep men overboard, winds that could knock a man off his feet, and cold that penetrated every layer of clothing. The crossing from New Zealand to Antarctica meant traversing some of the most challenging ocean waters on the planet. The Southern Ocean completely encircles Antarctica, unbroken by any landmass. This allows winds to build continuously, driving west to east in a pattern known as the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. These winds and currents create enormous waves, with storms that can last for days. Sailors had long ago named the latitude bands of the Southern Ocean based on the wind conditions they encountered. The Roaring Forties, between 40 and 50 degrees south, featured strong westerly winds and large waves. The Furious 50s, between 50 and 60 degrees south, were even worse, with winds that could exceed gale force and waves reaching 40 to 50 feet in height. And the Screaming 60s, south of 60 degrees, featured the most extreme conditions, where winds could reach hurricane strength and icebergs drifted north from the Antarctic continent. The ships of Task Force 43 pushed south through these zones, their hulls rising and falling through massive swells. On cargo ships like the Wyandotte and Arneb, equipment had to be triple-lashed to prevent shifting. Men wedged themselves into bunks to sleep, and eating while food slid across tables required careful timing. Seasickness was common, even among experienced sailors. The ships would pitch forward into a trough, then rise slowly up the face of the next wave, pause at the crest, and crash down the other side, sending shudders through the entire vessel. The icebreakers, with their reinforced hulls and more compact design, handled the heavy seas better than the cargo ships, but even they were tossed about by the relentless Southern Ocean. Waves would break over the bow, sending spray hundreds of feet into the air, where it would freeze instantly in the cold air and coat the ship's superstructure in a layer of ice. Too much ice accumulation could make a ship top-heavy and dangerously unstable, requiring crew members to venture out on deck with hammers and shovels to chip away the ice, a task made treacherous by the pitching deck and freezing spray. As the ships crossed 60 degrees south latitude, they entered the Antarctic Treaty Area, waters where the first icebergs appeared on the horizon. Antarctic icebergs are not like their Arctic cousins. Arctic icebergs are typically irregular and jagged, carved from valley glacier. Antarctic icebergs often carve from the massive ice shelves that fringe the continent, creating tabular bergs that can be miles long with flat tops and vertical sides rising 100 feet or more above the water. These ice islands drift in the Southern Ocean for years, slowly melting as they move north into warmer waters. Navigating through iceberg-filled waters required constant vigilance. Lookouts were posted on the bow and bridge, watching for ice in the water. Radar helped detect larger bergs, but smaller growlers, chunks of ice the size of a car floating low in the water, were difficult to spot and could damage a ship's hull if struck at speed. Ships reduced speed and maneuvered carefully, altering course to avoid ice while maintaining their general heading toward Antarctica. As they pushed farther south, the sea surface began to change. Instead of open water, they encountered fields of pack ice, flat pieces of sea ice that formed when the ocean froze. In early summer, this pack ice was breaking up, with open leads of water between ice floes. But in some areas, the ice was still solid, requiring the icebreakers to take the lead. USS Glacier pushed to the front of the formation and began ramming the ice. The ship would back up, then surge forward, riding up onto the ice and crushing it with her weight. The sound was tremendous, the grinding crack of ice breaking, the vibration transmitted through the entire hull, the roar of the engines at full power. Behind Glacier, the cargo ships followed single file through the channel of broken ice, careful to stay in the path the icebreaker had cleared. Progress was slow, sometimes measured in miles per day rather than the typical 10 to 15 knots ships made in open water. The ice could be several feet thick, and in some areas, pressure ridges where ice floes had collided and buckled could be 10 feet high or more. These pressure ridges required repeated ramming, with the icebreaker attacking from different angles to break through. And there was always the danger that the ice could close behind them, trapping the ships. Ice moved with winds and currents, and open water could freeze over within hours in the cold Antarctic conditions. Expedition history was filled with examples of ships trapped in ice, Shackletoe's Endurance, crushed and sunk in the Weddell Sea in 1915, Bird's Bear of Oakland, trapped for weeks during Operation High Jump, and countless other vessels that had come to grief in the ice. But Task Force 43 had advantages their predecessors lacked. Modern icebreakers were far more powerful than anything available in the heroic age. Radio communications allowed ships to coordinate movements and report ice conditions. Aircraft could scout ahead, reporting the location of open water and navigable leads through the ice. And weather forecasting had improved, giving commanders advance warning of storms and adverse conditions. As the ships approached the Ross Sea, the ice conditions improved. The Ross Sea extends deep into the Antarctic continent, a large bay partially covered by the Ross Ice Shelf. Icebreakers had made this route navigable in recent years, establishing it as the primary approach to the American sector of Antarctica. On December 20, 1955, the ships of Task Force 43 entered McMurdo Sound, a stretch of water at the southern end of the Ross Sea, bounded by Ross Island to the west and the continent to the east. This was the same area Ross had explored over a century before, and where Scott and Shackleton had established their bases in the early 1900s. Ross Island is a volcanic island dominated by Mount Erebus, an active volcano rising 12,448 feet above sea level. Erebus is one of the few volcanoes with a persistent lava lake in its summit crater, and its plume of volcanic gas can be seen from miles away. The island is roughly 50 miles long, covered by glacier that flow down from Erebus to the sea, creating ice cliffs and ice tongues that extend into the water. The southern tip of Ross Island features Hut Point Peninsula, a rocky promontory of volcanic rock that extends into McMurdo Sound. This was where Scott's Discovery expedition had built a hut in 1902, a simple wooden structure that still stood, perfectly preserved by the cold, dry Antarctic climate. And this was where Operation Deep Freeze would establish McMurdo Station, the main American base in Antarctica. The location was chosen for several reasons. The rocky ground provided a stable foundation for buildings, unlike the ice shelves that slowly flowed and could break away from the continent. The waters of McMurdo Sound were accessible by ship for several weeks each summer, allowing for resupply by sea. The site was close to the Ross Ice Shelf, which would serve as an airfield for wheeled aircraft, and close to the Transantarctic Mountains, allowing for geological research. And symbolically, it continued the legacy of Scott's expeditions, honoring the British explorer who had died so close to this location. But before construction could begin, tragedy struck. On January 6, 1956, Richard T. Williams, a Navy tractor operator, was driving a DR-8 Caterpillar tractor across the sea ice near Cape Royds, on the western side of Ross Island. Without warning, the ice gave way beneath the tractor. Williams and the tractor plunged through into the freezing water of McMurdo Sound. Rescue efforts were immediate, but the tractor sank quickly, dragging Williams with it. His body was never recovered. Williams became the first fatality of Operation Deep Freeze, a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in Antarctic operations. The ice, which looked solid and safe, could conceal weak spots, crevasses, or areas where ocean currents had thinned the ice from below. Every movement across the ice carried risk. Less than 2 months later, on March 5, 1956, another tragedy occurred. Max R. Keel, a Navy aircraft mechanic, fell into a crevasse near Little America 5 on the Ross Ice Shelf. Crevasses are deep cracks in glacial ice, formed by the stress of ice movement. They can be hundreds of feet deep, with vertical walls of hard ice, and they are often concealed beneath snow bridges that look solid but are actually fragile coverings that can collapse under weight. Keel's fall into the crevasse was witnessed by others in his group, but the crevasse was too deep and the walls too sheer for immediate rescue. Recovery efforts took hours, and by the time Keel was brought to the surface, he had succumbed to his injuries and the extreme cold. He was the second casualty of Operation Deep Freeze, and his death highlighted the hidden dangers of crevasse fields, which were common on the ice shelves and glacier of Antarctica. These deaths weighed heavily on Admiral Dufek and the other commanders of Operation Deep Freeze. They had known that casualties were possible, even likely, in such a dangerous environment. But that knowledge didn't make the losses any easier to bear. Each man was a volunteer who had come to Antarctica to serve his country and advance science. Their sacrifices would be honored, and their names would be commemorated in Antarctic place names, but nothing could bring them back. Despite these tragedies, Operation Deep Freeze pressed forward. There was a mission to accomplish, and the construction season was short. The ships had arrived at McMurdo Sound, and now the massive task of unloading supplies and building a base began in earnest. McMurdo Station was officially established on February 16, 1956, though construction had begun weeks earlier. The site chosen was a small flat area of volcanic rock on the southern tip of Hut Point Peninsula, with the ice-covered waters of McMurdo Sound stretching to the north and the towering bulk of Mount Erebus rising to the northeast. Scott's Discovery Hut, built in 1902, stood about a mile away along the shore. The hut was a simple wooden building, surrounded by rusting equipment and supplies left behind by Scott's expedition over 50 years before. The dry, cold Antarctic climate had preserved everything, creating a time capsule from the heroic age of exploration. The hut would serve as a poignant reminder to the men of Operation Deep Freeze that they were following in the footsteps of earlier explorers, but with vastly superior technology and support. Unloading supplies from the ships was an enormous undertaking. Thousands of tons of material had to be moved from ship holds to shore. The cargo ships anchored as close to shore as water depth allowed, and cargo was transferred using ships' cranes, barges, and later, when ice conditions permitted, directly onto the sea ice, where tractors and sleds could haul it to shore. The supplies included virtually everything needed to build and sustain a base in Antarctica. Prefabricated building panels, each measuring 4 feet by 8 feet, formed the basic structure of buildings. These panels consisted of an exterior layer of plywood, an interior layer of aluminum sheeting, and a core of fiberglass insulation. The panels interlocked with each other, with gaskets to seal joints and prevent air leakage. Buildings could be assembled rapidly by bolting panels together to form walls and roofs, much like a giant Lego set. Also unloaded were diesel generators for electrical power, complete with fuel tanks and distribution equipment. Water production equipment, since all water would come from melting snow or ice. Radios and communications equipment to maintain contact with other bases and the outside world. Scientific instruments for weather monitoring, seismology, and atmospheric studies. Vehicles, including tractors, trucks, forklifts, and specialized tracked vehicles designed for snow travel. Fuel drums by the hundreds, containing diesel, gasoline, and aviation fuel. Food supplies carefully packed to withstand freezing temperatures, everything from canned goods to frozen meats to dehydrated vegetables. And personal gear for the personnel who would winter over, from bunks to clothing to recreational equipment. Every item had been carefully catalogued before loading, and unloading had to be done in a specific sequence so that priority items were available when needed. Construction materials had to come off first, so that buildings could be erected to provide shelter and workspace. Then generators and fuel, so power would be available. Then scientific equipment, food, and other supplies. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Men worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, taking advantage of the continuous daylight of the Antarctic summer to maximize progress. But even in summer, temperatures were often below freezing, and wind was a constant challenge. Cargo nets swinging from cranes had to be carefully controlled to prevent loads from swinging wildly in the wind. Heavy equipment had to be operated with care on uneven, icy ground. And every worker had to watch for signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. The building design used at McMurdo represented a significant advance over earlier Antarctic structures. Scott and Shackleton had used wooden huts, which were difficult to heat and often felt little warmer inside than outside. Byrd's Little America bases had used a mix of prefabricated buildings and structures carved into the ice itself. But the buildings designed for Operation Deep Freeze incorporated lessons learned from military construction in cold climates during World War II and the Korean War. The key was insulation. The fiberglass insulation in the wall and roof panels provided much better thermal resistance than the single-layer wood construction of earlier huts. The aluminum interior sheeting provided a vapor barrier, preventing moisture from condensing inside walls where it could freeze and degrade insulation. And the modular panel design meant buildings could be assembled quickly without requiring specialized carpentry skills. Buildings were erected on wooden foundations set on the volcanic rock, elevated slightly to prevent heat from the buildings from melting the permafrost and causing subsidence. Each building type was designed for a specific purpose: dormitories to house personnel, a galley and mess hall for preparing and eating meals, workshops for maintaining vehicles and equipment, a science building for laboratories and research, a communications building for radios, and a power plant for generators. The largest building was the administration and communal space, which included offices, a small library, a recreation room, and the galley. This building would serve as the social center of the base, where men gathered after work to eat, read, play games, or simply talk. The psychological importance of such communal spaces had been recognized by earlier expeditions. Isolation and confinement could lead to tension and conflict, but shared activities and comfortable common spaces helped maintain morale. Power generation was critical. Everything at McMurdo depended on electrical power, heating systems that kept interior temperatures above freezing, lighting during the dark winter months, communications equipment connecting the base to the outside world, scientific instruments recording data continuously, and equipment necessary for daily operations. Multiple diesel generators were installed in a dedicated powerhouse, with built-in redundancy so that if one generator failed, others could instantly pick up the electrical load and maintain power throughout the base. The generators ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, their steady hum becoming the background soundtrack of base life. They consumed enormous quantities of diesel fuel, measured in thousands of gallons per week, making fuel conservation absolutely essential. Every gallon of fuel had to be shipped thousands of miles from the United States, unloaded from ships in a brief summer window, and carefully rationed to ensure the supply lasted until the next resupply ship arrived the following summer. Running out of fuel meant losing power, which meant losing heat, which meant the base would become uninhabitable within hours in the Antarctic cold. The margin for error was zero. The heavy equipment used in construction represented the cutting edge of cold weather engineering. The Seabees operated SDLGP D8 bulldozers, specially modified for Antarctic operations with extended track frames that increased the footprint to reduce ground pressure, allowing them to operate on soft snow without sinking. These dozers featured tracks that were 54 inches wide and frames extended by 4 feet beyond standard specifications, creating a ground pressure of just 4.3 pounds per square inch. Their blades measured 18.5 feet wide, capable of moving enormous volumes of snow with each pass. The equipment had to be maintained meticulously, with machinery preheated before starting, special low-temperature lubricants used throughout, and metal components inspected constantly for cold-induced brittleness that could cause catastrophic failures. Water production was another constant challenge. Antarctica is technically a desert, receiving very little precipitation, but it contains 90% of the world's ice. The paradox is that water is everywhere in frozen form but requires energy to melt. Snow and ice were collected in large melters, essentially giant heated tanks, where they were converted to liquid water. This water was used for drinking, cooking, washing, and industrial purposes. Nothing could be wasted, because producing water consumed precious fuel. The construction crews worked through late February and March as the Antarctic summer drew to a close. Temperatures began dropping, and the sun, which had been circling the sky 24 hours a day, began dipping toward the horizon for longer periods each day. By late March, there were a few hours of twilight each day, and by late April, the sun would set and not rise again until late August. The ships needed to depart before the sea ice became too thick for even icebreakers to penetrate, which typically happened in late February or early March. By mid-February 1956, McMurdo Station was functional, though far from complete. The essential buildings were up and equipped, power and water systems were operating, and supplies were staged for the winter-over crew. Approximately 90 men would remain at McMurdo through the first winter, mostly Seabees who would continue construction work during the winter months, along with Navy support personnel and a few scientists. As the ships prepared to depart, Admiral Dufek addressed the winter-over crew. He acknowledged the challenges they would face, the isolation, the darkness, the cold, and the responsibility they carried as the first men to establish a permanent American presence on Antarctica. He expressed confidence in their abilities and thanked them for their service. Then the ships departed, pushing north through the ice, leaving the men of McMurdo Station alone at the bottom of the world. But McMurdo was only one piece of Operation Deep Freeze. The most ambitious goal of the operation was to establish a station at the geographic South Pole itself, the first permanent human presence at the axis of the Earth's rotation, in one of the harshest environments on the planet. This mission would require extraordinary planning, incredible logistics, and men willing to endure conditions that pushed human survival to its absolute limits. The idea of placing a station at the South Pole had both scientific and symbolic value. Scientifically, the pole offered unique research opportunities. The Earth's magnetic field lines converged at the poles, making them ideal locations for studying geomagnetism and upper atmosphere physics. The pole's location at 90 degrees south latitude meant that the sun appeared to circle the horizon once per year, rising at the September equinox and setting at the March equinox, creating 6 months of continuous daylight followed by 6 months of continuous darkness. This unique solar environment affected atmospheric conditions and weather patterns in ways that could only be studied at the poles. Additionally, the South Pole sat atop the Antarctic ice sheet at an altitude of approximately 9,300 feet. However, because cold air is denser than warm air and sinks, the barometric pressure at the pole was equivalent to an altitude of 11,000 feet or more at temperate latitudes. This physiological altitude caused altitude sickness, impaired physical and cognitive performance, and made any physical work exhausting. And the cold was extreme. Winter temperatures at the South Pole could reach 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And even in summer, temperatures rarely rose above -20. With wind, the wind chill could reach 140 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in seconds. Symbolically, placing a station at the South Pole would demonstrate American technological capability and determination. The Soviet Union had announced plans to establish a South Pole station as well, and the Cold War competition extended even to this frozen wasteland. Being first to the pole and successfully maintaining a year-round presence there would be a significant achievement. But how could supplies be delivered to the South Pole, 800 miles from McMurdo Station across the Antarctic plateau? There were no roads, no railways, no navigable rivers. The only options were overland tractor traverses, which were slow, dangerous, and limited in cargo capacity, or airlift, using aircraft to fly supplies to the pole. Operation Deep Freeze chose the airlift option, relying on ski-equipped aircraft to land on the polar ice cap and deliver supplies. Before construction could begin, someone needed to actually reach the pole and verify that aircraft could safely land there. This mission was assigned to Admiral Dufek personally, and it resulted in one of the most dramatic moments of Operation Deep Freeze. On October 31, 1956, an AF-D-5L aircraft, the Navy designation for a ski-equipped Douglas DC-3, took off from McMurdo Station bound for the South Pole. The aircraft was named Q Serra Serra, Spanish for whatever will be, a phrase that captured both the uncertainty and fatalistic acceptance of the mission. The aircraft was piloted by Lieutenant Commander Conrad Gus Shin, with Lieutenant Frederick Ferrara as co-pilot and Air Controlman Douglas Cordina as navigator. Admiral Dufek was aboard as well, determined to be among the first to reach the pole by air since Byrd's 1929 flight. The flight covered 800 miles over featureless ice, with no landmarks for navigation. Cordina relied on dead reckoning and celestial navigation, using a sextant to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon and calculating their position from that. As they flew south, the ice surface below was nearly featureless, a flat white expanse broken only by sastrugi, wind-carved ridges in the snow that ran parallel to prevailing winds. After several hours of flight, Cordina announced they were approaching the pole. The question was whether they could land. The surface conditions were unknown. The ice could be smooth or rough, hard or soft. If the ski-equipped aircraft hit a rough patch or broke through a crust of snow, it could nose over, destroying the plane and stranding the crew hundreds of miles from help with temperatures well below zero and no shelter. Shin circled the pole, looking for the smoothest area. Then he brought the aircraft down in a low pass, almost touching the surface with the skis, testing the snow. It seemed solid. He climbed, circled again, and then committed to landing. The skis touched the snow, and the aircraft slid along the surface, slowing gradually, and came to a stop. They had made it. Admiral Dufek and the crew climbed out of the aircraft into the brutal cold. The temperature was around 60 degrees below zero, and wind added to the chill. But they were standing at the geographic South Pole for the first time since Amundsen and Scott's expeditions nearly 45 years earlier, and the first time anyone had landed an aircraft there. Dufek planted an American flag at the pole, marked the location with survey stakes, and took photographs. The crew spent less than an hour on the surface, constrained by the cold, the aircraft's fuel supply, and the risk of not being able to restart the engines if they cooled too much. Then they climbed back aboard, Shin started the engines, and they took off, heading back to McMurdo. The flight proved that aircraft could land at the South Pole, opening the way for construction of the station. But it also proved just how challenging conditions at the pole would be. The cold was breathtaking, and exposure for more than a few minutes without shelter was potentially fatal. The altitude made breathing difficult and any physical exertion exhausting. And a landing at the pole was not without risk, even under the best conditions. Plans were made for a more substantial airlift to the pole. In November 1956, an advance party of 8 men would be flown to the pole aboard multiple R4D flights. This advance party would be led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Bowers and would consist entirely of Seabees. Their mission was to prepare a more reliable landing surface, begin construction of rudimentary shelters, and receive the first deliveries of construction materials. On November 20, 1956, the advance party flew to the pole. Each man carried survival gear in case they were stranded, aware that if something went wrong, rescue might be days away or impossible. They landed safely and immediately set to work. The construction challenges at the South Pole were unlike anything the Seabees had encountered before. The altitude made every physical task exhausting, even something as simple as walking left men gasping for breath. The cold was so extreme that metal tools became painful to touch even through gloves, and machinery often refused to start or operate properly. The wind was constant, blowing snow across the surface and creating white oak conditions that reduced visibility to a few feet. And there was the psychological challenge of knowing they were 800 miles from the nearest other human beings, in a place where temperatures could drop to 100 below, where a single equipment failure or injury could be fatal, and where rescue would be difficult if not impossible. Despite these challenges, the Seabees persevered. They worked in short shifts, going outside for 30 minutes to an hour, then returning to heated tents to warm up before venturing out again. They learned to work slowly and deliberately, because rushing led to exhaustion, mistakes, and injuries. They learned to watch each other for signs of frostbite, the white patches on skin that indicated tissue freezing, and to warm affected areas immediately before permanent damage occurred. The initial priority was establishing a reliable aircraft landing surface. The Seabees used tractors to smooth and compact snow into a runway, marking it with flags so pilots could see it from the air. This work was brutally slow, with tractors frequently breaking down in the cold and operators becoming exhausted after short periods of work. While some Seabees prepared the airstrip, others began assembling the first structures. The South Pole Station would use the same prefabricated panel design as McMurdo, but adapted for more extreme conditions. Buildings would be smaller and more heavily insulated, and they would be constructed partially buried in the snow to provide additional protection from wind. Delivering construction materials to the pole required extensive airlifts. See the 124 Globemaster transport aircraft. Some of the largest aircraft in the US military at that time flew from McMurdo carrying pallets of building panels, fuel drums, generators, food, and equipment. At the pole, these supplies were pushed out the rear cargo door of the aircraft, dropping several feet to the snow, where Seabees rushed to retrieve them and clear the landing area for the next aircraft. These airdrops had to be executed carefully. The C-124 couldn't land at the pole, its weight would break through the snow surface, so supplies were dropped while the aircraft was still airborne, flying as low and slow as safely possible. Some loads broke apart on impact, scattering supplies across the ice. Fuel drums sometimes burst, spilling precious fuel that instantly froze. But enough material got through to allow construction to continue. Over the following weeks, the advance party assembled a small complex of buildings, a bunkhouse for sleeping, a galley and mess hall, a workshop, a generator building, and a science building. The work was painfully slow, but by late December, the basic station was functional. On January 4, 1957, the construction crew departed the pole, flown back to McMurdo aboard our 4D aircraft. They left behind the winter-over crew, 18 men who would occupy the station through the Antarctic winter. 9 were Navy personnel led by Lieutenant Junior Grade John Tuck, responsible for operating and maintaining the station. 9 were civilian scientists from the International Geophysical Year program, led by Paul Seipel, whose mission was to conduct research. The station was officially commissioned on January 1, 1957, and named the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, honoring both the first man to reach the pole and the British explorer who died trying. It was a moment of triumph. Humans had established a permanent presence at one of the most extreme locations on Earth. Paul Seipel was an appropriate choice to lead the first scientific winter-over crew at the pole. He had been to Antarctica before, as a teenager with Admiral Byrd's first expedition in 1928 to 1930. Seipel had been an Eagle Scout, selected in a nationwide competition to accompany Byrd as a representative of American youth. He had fallen in love with Antarctica and returned on several of Byrd's subsequent expeditions. Seipel had become a respected polar researcher, and he had coined the term wind chill to describe the combined effect of wind and cold on exposed flesh, a concept that would become central to understanding survival in polar environments. Now, at age 48, Seipel was returning to Antarctica for what might be his last expedition, this time to spend an entire winter at the South Pole, experiencing conditions more extreme than anything he had encountered before. As January turned to February and February to March, the sun began dipping below the horizon for longer periods each day. By late March, there were only a few hours of twilight each day. And on March 22, 1957, the sun set at the South Pole and would not rise again until September 22, 6 months later. The winter-over crew settled into their routines. The scientists conducted experiments, collected meteorological data, monitored upper atmosphere conditions, and studied the unique environment of the pole. The Navy crew operated the generators, maintained equipment, produced water from melted snow, prepared meals, and kept the station functioning. Life at the South Pole in winter was surreal. The temperature dropped to 90 degrees below zero, then to 95, then to 99. The cold was so extreme that going outside required full cold weather gear, multiple layers of clothing, insulated boots rated to 100 below, thick mittens, face masks, and goggles. Even then, exposure was limited to minutes. Frostbite was a constant threat. Moisture from breath froze instantly on face masks, building up ice that had to be chipped away. Fingers and toes went numb within minutes, and warming them was painful as circulation returned. Inside the station, life was more comfortable, but still challenging. The buildings were heated, but the temperature difference between inside and outside, often more than 100 degrees, created condensation problems. Moisture from breathing, cooking, and washing condensed on cold surfaces, and if those surfaces were below freezing, the moisture turned to ice. Ice built up on walls, ceilings, and equipment, and had to be scraped away regularly. The darkness was psychologically challenging. Without natural daylight, the body's circadian rhythms were disrupted. Some men had trouble sleeping, others were constantly tired. The isolation was profound. They were nearly 1,000 miles from the nearest other humans, with no possibility of rescue until spring. Communication with the outside world was limited to scheduled radio contacts, and even those were sometimes impossible due to atmospheric conditions. Yet the men adapted. They maintained strict routines, eating meals at regular times, working regular shifts, and scheduling recreational activities. They celebrated holidays and birthdays, creating a sense of community and normalcy. They watched movies, read books, played cards, and talked. They supported each other through difficult periods, recognizing that they were all in this together, dependent on each other for survival. And they conducted science. The data they collected on temperature, wind, atmospheric pressure, and upper atmosphere conditions would contribute to the International Geophysical Year and expand human understanding of the polar regions. They were making history, and they knew it. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the sun finally rose above the horizon on September 22, 1957. The men of the South Pole Station gathered outside to witness the sunrise, the first direct sunlight they had seen in 6 months. It was an emotional moment, a visible sign that they had survived the winter, that spring was coming, and that they would soon see their families again. Aircraft from McMurdo arrived in October with fresh supplies, mail, and relief crews. The first winter over crew prepared to depart, their mission accomplished. They had proven that humans could survive year-round at the South Pole. They had collected valuable scientific data. And they had opened the door for continued human presence at the bottom of the world. Operation Deep Freeze had succeeded in establishing not just one, but multiple permanent bases across Antarctica. McMurdo Station had grown into a substantial facility capable of supporting hundreds of personnel during the summer and dozens through the winter. Little America 5 on the Ross Ice Shelf served as a forward base for research on the ice shelf. Byrd Station, established 800 miles from McMurdo in the interior of West Antarctica, provided data from a different climatic zone. Hallett Station on the coast studied penguins and seabirds. And the South Pole Station represented the pinnacle of human achievement in extreme environment operations. Other nations participating in the International Geophysical Year established their own bases around Antarctica. The Soviet Union built several stations, including Vostok Station near the South Geomagnetic Pole, which would later record the coldest temperature ever measured on Earth, -128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Britain, France, Australia, Argentina, Chile, Japan, Belgium, and South Africa all maintained research stations, creating a network of scientific observation points spanning the continent. The IGY transformed Antarctica from a remote, occasionally visited wilderness into a laboratory for international scientific cooperation. The success of the IGY led directly to the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, which designated Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banned military activity, and suspended territorial claims. The the treaty remains in force today, one of the most successful international agreements ever negotiated, allowing science to flourish in a region that might otherwise have become another front in Cold War competition. The men who participated in Operation Deep Freeze, from the admirals who planned it to the Seabees who built the bases to the scientists who wintered over, made history. They pushed the boundaries of human endurance and capability. They demonstrated that with proper planning, technology, and determination, humans could survive and work even in the most extreme environments on Earth. They laid the foundation for all subsequent Antarctic research, and their legacy continues today in the dozens of year-round stations operating across the continent. The bases established during Operation Deep Freeze still operate more than 65 years later. McMurdo Station is now the largest settlement in Antarctica, supporting over 1,000 people during the summer months. The Amundsen Scott South Pole Station has been rebuilt multiple times, each version incorporating new technologies and lessons learned from previous experience, but it continues to occupy the same location where Admiral Dufek planted the flag and the first winter-over crew endured 6 months of darkness. Antarctica remains a place of extremes, a place that demands respect and careful preparation. But it is no longer the unknown continent it was in Cook's time, or even in Scott's time. It is a place where humans live and work year-round, where scientists from around the world collaborate on research projects ranging from climate science to astrophysics to biology. And it all began with Operation Deep Freeze, the massive undertaking that brought civilization, however temporary and fragile, to the last wilderness on Earth. The story of Operation Deep Freeze is a story of courage, determination, ingenuity, and cooperation. It is a story of men facing incredible challenges and overcoming them through skill, planning, and sheer willpower. It is a story of scientific ambition and international collaboration transcending political differences. And it is a reminder that humans, when working together toward common goals, can achieve the seemingly impossible. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those men who lived through the Antarctic winter at the South Pole, who endured 6 months of darkness and cold that can barely be imagined, who were separated from their families and homes by thousands of miles of ice and ocean. Think about the Seabees who built bases in conditions where machinery froze and metal shattered. Think about the pilots who flew into blizzards to deliver supplies, the sailors who navigated through pack ice and towering waves, and the scientists who collected data that expanded human knowledge. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things. And their story continues to inspire, decades later, reminding us that the human spirit, when challenged, can rise to meet even the most daunting obstacles. The plans for expansion were already forming before the first winter had ended. Even as the men at McMurdo and Little America endured those long dark months, the Navy and National Science Foundation were drawing up blueprints for what would come next. Operation Deep Freeze 2 would begin in October 1956, just months after the first crews emerged from their winter isolation. This time, the mission would be even more ambitious. Instead of 2 stations, the United States would establish 5 permanent bases scattered across the continent, each one serving a specific scientific purpose, each one pushing deeper into unexplored territory. The jewel of this expansion would be Little America 5, though the numbering system might seem confusing at first. Little America 4 had been the main base during that first winter, built on the Ross Ice Shelf near the Bay of Whales. But even as it was being constructed, planners knew it had limitations. The Bay of Whales itself was unstable, constantly shifting as the ice shelf carved and reformed. They needed a more permanent location nearby but safer, away from the unpredictable ice edge. So Little America 5 would be built about 30 miles east of Little America 4, at a location called Kainan Bay. Construction began on January 3, 1956, right in the middle of the Antarctic summer, when round-the-clock daylight and relatively warmer temperatures made heavy construction work possible. What made Little America 5 different from its predecessors was the decision to build it entirely below the snow line. Instead of constructing buildings on top of the ice that would gradually be buried by accumulating snow, the engineers decided to embrace the snow, to work with it rather than against it. They excavated deep trenches and pits into the ice shelf, creating a network of underground chambers connected by tunnels. The main structures, prefabricated steel buildings, were lowered into these excavated pits. Then the spaces between the buildings and the ice walls were carefully insulated. Vehicle ramps were carved into the snow, descending at gentle angles so that tractors and sleds could drive directly into the underground complex. The entire base became a warren of interconnected passages, warm and protected from the surface winds that could reach 100 miles per hour during storms. Living underground had its advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, the temperature remained relatively stable. The ice itself provided excellent insulation, and the snowdrifts that accumulated on the surface only added to that protective blanket. Men could move between buildings without exposure to the elements, walking through lighted tunnels instead of battling across windswept ice. The vehicles could be maintained in underground garages where the mechanics didn't have to work with frozen hands and numb faces. But there were trade-offs too. The lack of natural light could be oppressive. Even during the summer months when the sun never set, the men inside Little America 5 worked and lived in artificial light. The air quality required constant attention, with ventilation systems running continuously to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. The psychological impact of living like moles, always aware of the thousands of tons of ice pressing down from above, wore on some men more than others. Little America 5 served as one of the major international geophysical year bases from July 1, 1957 to December 31, 1958. During those 18 months, it hosted dozens of scientists and support personnel conducting coordinated observations across multiple disciplines. The data collected there, from meteorological readings to seismic recordings, would flow into the larger IGY database, combined with observations from stations around the world to create the most comprehensive picture of Earth's systems ever attempted. But Little America 5 had a fascinating fate that nobody could have predicted when they built it. The ice shelf it sat on, seemingly solid and permanent, was actually flowing steadily toward the sea. Every year, the Ross Ice Shelf advances several hundred feet toward the ocean. Usually, this movement is balanced by calving events where huge chunks break off and drift away as icebergs. In 1987, an enormous section of the ice shelf broke free, an iceberg so massive it was designated B9. Little America 5, abandoned for decades by then, was sitting right on that piece of ice. The entire base, all those underground tunnels and buried buildings, went to sea aboard iceberg B9, slowly drifting northward through the Ross Sea until eventually the iceberg broke up in warmer waters. Somewhere beneath the Southern Ocean, the ruins of Little America 5 remain, a time capsule of 1950s Antarctic exploration resting on the seafloor. But Little America 5 was just one piece of the expansion puzzle. The most ambitious new station was Byrd Station, named in honor of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the legendary Antarctic explorer who had first flown over the South Pole in 1929. Byrd Station was planned for a location at 80 degrees south latitude and 80 degrees west longitude, deep in the interior of West Antarctica. This placed it more than 600 miles from Little America, more than 500 miles from the South Pole, at an elevation of about 5,000 feet on the inland ice sheet. This was exactly the kind of location the scientists wanted. While coastal stations could study weather patterns and ocean interactions, and the South Pole Station could gather data from the heart of the continent, Byrd Station would provide crucial information about the vast interior ice sheets that covered most of West Antarctica. Getting equipment and materials to Byrd Station would be a monumental challenge. Everything had to be carried overland by tractor train across hundreds of miles of crevasse-riddled ice, or flown in by ski-equipped aircraft operating at the edge of their range. The Navy's construction battalions approached the problem methodically. They pre-positioned fuel caches along the route, essentially creating a supply chain across empty ice. They mapped safe paths through the crevasse fields using ground-penetrating radar and careful probing. And they developed new techniques for building in the deep snow and extreme cold of the interior, where temperatures could drop to 60 below zero even in summer. Byrd Station was commissioned in January 1957, just barely meeting the deadline to be operational for the International Geophysical Year. The first winter over crew faced unique challenges. While McMurdo and South Pole had the psychological comfort of knowing other stations weren't too far away, Byrd Station was truly isolated. If something went wrong, if someone got seriously ill or injured, rescue would be nearly impossible during the winter months. The men stationed there were completely on their own from February until October, when the first aircraft could fly in again. The scientific work they conducted made the isolation worthwhile. Byrd Station's instruments recorded weather patterns that nobody had observed before, tracking how storms formed in the interior and moved toward the coast. The seismometers detected earthquakes from around the world, their signals traveling through the solid earth and recorded on spinning drums of paper. The glaciology team drilled ice cores, cylindrical samples extracted from deep in the ice sheet, each core revealing layers of snow that had fallen hundreds or even thousands of years ago, preserved in perfect chronological order. Far to the north of Byrd Station, on the coast of Victoria Land, another new station was taking shape through an international partnership. Hallett Station would be a joint operation between the United States and New Zealand, reflecting the strong collaboration between the two nations in Antarctic exploration. The site chosen for Hallett was unusual, one of the few ice-free areas along the Victoria Land coast. This rocky peninsula, jutting out into the Ross Sea, was home to an enormous Adderley penguin rookery. Tens of thousands of penguins returned here every spring to breed, filling the air with their braying calls and creating a living, squabbling carpet of black and white birds. Building a research station in the middle of a penguin colony required careful planning. The construction crews had to work around the birds, avoiding disturbing the rookery as much as possible. But the ice-free rock also made construction easier in some ways. They didn't have to worry about buildings sinking into snow or being buried by drift. Foundations could be anchored directly to bedrock. The station buildings were placed on the edge of the rookery, close enough for easy observation of the penguins but far enough to minimize disruption to their breeding activities. Hallett Station became operational in January 1957, its small crew of American and New Zealand scientists and support personnel working side by side. The biological research conducted there was groundbreaking. Scientists could observe the entire penguin breeding cycle up close, from the arrival of the first birds in spring, to courtship and nest building, through egg laying and chick rearing, to the departure of the young penguins in autumn. They banded thousands of birds, tracking their movements and survival rates over multiple years. They studied the penguins' diving behavior, their feeding ecology, their adaptations to extreme cold. Across the continent on the opposite side of Antarctica, Wilkes Station was being established on the Bud coast of East Antarctica. This station was named for Charles Wilkes, the American naval officer who had led an exploring expedition to Antarctica from 1839 to 1840, one of the earliest American ventures to Antarctic waters. Wilkes Station's location put it in the sector claimed by Australia, though under the Antarctic Treaty provisions being negotiated, such claims would be set aside for scientific cooperation. The station would provide crucial data from the East Antarctic ice sheet, a region that was even less understood than West Antarctica. The ice here was older, thicker, potentially more stable. Understanding its behavior was essential for comprehending global climate patterns. The logistics of building Wilkes Station were complicated by its remoteness from the main American bases in the Ross Sea region. Ships had to approach from the Australian ports, fighting through pack ice that was unpredictable and often heavy. The construction crews worked quickly during the brief summer window, knowing they had only a few weeks to land supplies and erect the essential buildings before the sea ice closed in and the ships had to retreat. The station that emerged was compact and efficient, designed for a small winter-over crew of perhaps a dozen men. Every square foot of space was carefully planned to minimize waste while providing adequate room for living, working, and storing supplies for the long isolation ahead. Perhaps the most challenging location was Ellsworth Station, planned for the Weddell Sea coast of Antarctica. The Weddell Sea is notorious among Antarctic mariners as one of the most difficult and dangerous areas to navigate. The sea ice there is thick, multi-year ice that doesn't fully break up even in summer. Enormous icebergs, carved from the ice shelves along the coast, drift in the ocean currents, sometimes becoming trapped in the pack ice for years. The winds that sweep across the Weddell Sea create pressure ridges, areas where ice flows have been forced together, creating jumbled walls of broken ice 20 or 30 feet high. Ships attempting to reach the Weddell coast have to fight their way through this maze, sometimes covering only a few miles in a day of hard ice-breaking work. But the Weddell Sea region was scientifically important. It represented a major gap in the network of observing stations. Weather systems that affected the entire Antarctic Peninsula and the South Atlantic originated in this area. The ice shelves here, particularly the Filchner and Ron ice shelves, were among the largest in Antarctica, and scientists needed to understand their dynamics. So despite the difficulties, Ellsworth Station was included in the plan. Ships carrying construction materials and supplies battled through the pack ice, sometimes getting stuck for days when the ice closed around them, engines running continuously to prevent being frozen in permanently. When they finally reached the coast, the offloading had to be done quickly before shifting ice forced them to move again. Ellsworth Station was eventually established, though the challenges of maintaining and resupplying it would prove so great that its operational life would be limited compared to the other bases. These 5 new stations, Little America 5, Byrd, Hallett, Wilkes, and Ellsworth, joined the already operational McMurdo Station and Amundsen Scott South Pole Station to create a network of 7 American bases operating simultaneously during the International Geophysical Year. This represented an unprecedented presence on the continent, an extraordinary investment of resources and manpower all dedicated to scientific research. But the American stations were just part of a much larger international effort. The Soviet Union, demonstrating both scientific ambition and Cold War competitive spirit, established multiple stations of their own. Their coastal station at Mirny became a hub for Soviet Antarctic operations, comparable in size and capability to McMurdo. From Mirny, the Soviets launched overland expeditions to establish interior stations, most notably Vostok Station, located at the geomagnetic South Pole at an elevation of more than 11,000 feet above sea level. Vostok would become famous in later decades for recording the coldest temperature ever measured on Earth, -128.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and for drilling the deepest ice cores ever obtained, reaching ice that was more than 400,000 years old. Britain, with its long history of Antarctic exploration reaching back to Scott and Shackleton, maintained several research stations, particularly in the Antarctic Peninsula region and on South Georgia Island. Australia operated stations in the sectors it had long been active in, building on decades of exploration and mapping work. New Zealand, in addition to partnering with the United States at Hallett Station, maintained its own station on Ross Island and supported expeditions into the Ross Sea region. France established a station on Isle des Petrels in Adélie Land, the sector of Antarctica nearest to French overseas territories. Argentina and Chile, viewing Antarctica as extensions of their South American territories, maintained multiple stations along the Antarctic Peninsula. Even Belgium and South Africa established research stations, contributing to the growing network of observation points. What made this international cooperation remarkable was the political context. This was 1957, the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in an intense rivalry that encompassed military buildups, nuclear weapons testing, space race competition, and ideological confrontation on every continent. Yet in Antarctica, American and Soviet scientists were coordinating their research, sharing data, agreeing on standardized observation protocols. They were demonstrating that even in an era of deep mistrust and hostility, scientific cooperation was possible when the goal was understanding the planet itself rather than dominating territory or resources. The International Geophysical Year ran from July 1, 1957 to December 31, 1958, though in practice the research programs continued beyond that formal endpoint because the infrastructure was in place and the scientific questions being investigated required long-term observation. The coordinated scientific program was extraordinarily comprehensive. Every station, regardless of which nation operated it, followed agreed-upon protocols for weather observations. Every 3 hours, or even more frequently during special observation periods, meteorologists recorded temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, cloud cover, precipitation. These observations were radioed to coordination centers where they were compiled and distributed. For the first time, scientists had near-real-time weather data from the entire Antarctic continent, allowing them to understand how weather systems formed, moved, and dissipated in this vast region that had been essentially invisible to previous generations of meteorologists. Seismology was another major focus. Seismometers installed at stations around Antarctica recorded earthquakes from around the world. The solid earth rings like a bell when struck by a major earthquake, and by comparing the arrival times and characteristics of seismic waves at different stations, scientists could determine the internal structure of the planet, identifying the boundaries between crust, mantle, and core with increasing precision. Antarctic seismometers also recorded local events, small earthquakes caused by glacial movements or ice shelf carving, providing insights into the dynamics of the ice sheets themselves. Geomagnetism, the study of Earth's magnetic field, was another key discipline. Magnetometers at each station continuously recorded variations in the magnetic field strength and orientation. These variations, caused by solar activity and interactions between the solar wind and Earth's magnetosphere, followed patterns that scientists were just beginning to understand. The data from Antarctic stations was particularly valuable because the magnetic field lines at high latitudes plunge down into the Earth, making these regions especially sensitive to magnetic storms and auroral activity. Scientists discovered that magnetic disturbances measured in Antarctica were often correlated with disturbances measured at corresponding latitudes in the Arctic, revealing the global nature of geomagnetic phenomena. Glaciology teams studied the ice itself. They measured accumulation rates, the amount of snow that fell each year and was compressed into ice. They measured ablation rates, the amount of ice lost to melting, sublimation, and carving. They used stakes and markers to track ice flow velocities, discovering that the ice sheets weren't static masses but were constantly flowing outward from the high interior plateaus toward the coasts, moving at rates from a few feet per year to hundreds of feet per year in fast-flowing ice streams. They drilled ice cores, initially reaching depths of 100 feet or so with the technology available in the late 1950s, but already glimpsing the potential for ice cores to reveal climate history. Each layer in an ice core represented 1 year of snowfall. Counting down through the layers was like reading a timeline extending into the past. The chemistry of the ice, the ratios of different isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen, could reveal what the temperature had been when that snow fell. Tiny bubbles trapped in the ice contained samples of ancient atmosphere, preserving the composition of air from decades or centuries or millennia ago. Upper atmosphere physics was a frontier science during the IGY. Scientists were just beginning to understand the ionosphere, the region of the atmosphere where solar radiation ionizes atoms and molecules, creating layers of electrically charged particles. These ionized layers reflected radio waves, making long-distance radio communication possible, but their behavior was complex and variable. During magnetic storms, when the solar wind intensified, the ionosphere could become turbulent, disrupting radio communications unpredictably. Instruments called ionosans, essentially specialized radars, bounce radio signals off the ionospheric layers to map their height and density. This work had practical applications for improving radio communications, but it also revealed fundamental physics about how solar energy interacted with the upper atmosphere. One of the most exciting discoveries of the IGY period came not from surface observations in Antarctica but from satellites launched during the same period. The United States launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, on January 31, 1958, joining the Soviet Union Sputnik satellites in orbit. Explorer 1 carried scientific instruments designed by physicist James Van Allen and his team at the University of Iowa. These instruments detected unexpectedly high levels of radiation in certain regions of space around Earth. Subsequent satellites confirmed and mapped these radiation zones, which came to be called the Van Allen radiation belts. These belts consist of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field, forming donut-shaped regions encircling the planet. The inner belt contains mostly protons, the outer belt mostly electrons. During magnetic storms, these belts can intensify and expand, posing hazards to satellites and astronauts passing through them. The discovery revolutionized understanding of Earth's space environment and had direct connections to observations being made at ground stations in Antarctica, where magnetic field variations and auroral displays were surface manifestations of the same processes trapping particles in the belts high above. The day-to-day reality for the men living at these Antarctic stations during the IGY was a mixture of routine, hardship, beauty, and occasional monotony. During the summer months when population swelled and aircraft and ships brought regular resupply, the stations buzzed with activity. Scientists rushed to complete field work that could only be done in summer, when traveling away from the station was possible. Construction crews worked around the clock to complete building projects, taking advantage of the 24-hour daylight and relatively warmer temperatures. But summer populations could reach 80 or 100 people at the larger stations, straining facilities that had been designed for much smaller winter crews. The mess halls were crowded and noisy. Bunks were stacked 2 or 3 high in cramped dormitories with minimal privacy. The bathrooms, with limited water supply, operated on strict schedules. Showers might be limited to 2 brief sessions per week, and men learned to soap and rinse with military efficiency. Winter was different. The last aircraft departed in February or early March, depending on location and weather. The ships had left weeks earlier, before the sea ice closed in. Suddenly the summer chaos was gone, replaced by a much smaller group, perhaps 20 or 30 men at the larger stations, fewer at the remote interior bases. These winter-over crews took on a different character. They would be completely isolated for the next 8 or 9 months, unable to leave, unable to be resupplied, dependent entirely on what had been stockpiled during summer. Medical emergencies would have to be handled with whatever the station doctor or medic could manage, since evacuation was impossible in winter. A serious injury or illness could be fatal, and everyone knew it. The daily routines revolved around maintaining the station and keeping the scientific observations running on schedule. Weather observations had to be taken every 3 hours, regardless of conditions outside. That meant someone bundling up in extreme cold weather gear and trudging out to the instrument shelter every few hours, day and night. The seismometers required daily maintenance, checking that the delicate recording needles were properly aligned and that the paper drums were rotating smoothly. The radio equipment needed constant attention because the extreme cold and condensation played havoc with electronics. Diesel generators provided power for lights, heat, and equipment, and they ran continuously, burning through thousands of gallons of fuel over the winter. Someone had to check the generators regularly, monitoring oil pressure and temperature, listening for any change in their steady rumble that might signal problems. The men organized their days around meals, which provided structure and social gathering points. Breakfast might be at 7 a.m., a hearty meal of pancakes or oatmeal, eggs if they still had fresh eggs left from the last supply ship, more likely powdered eggs scrambled with canned ham. Lunch was simple, often soup and sandwiches. Dinner was the main meal, when the cooks tried to provide something substantial and varied. The food was almost entirely canned or freeze-dried or frozen. Fresh fruits and vegetables, novelties at the beginning of winter, were long gone by midwinter. Men craved fresh food with an intensity that was almost irrational. The monthly supply flights that came during summer had sometimes included small luxuries, an apple, an orange, and these were treasured far beyond their actual value. The psychological challenges of wintering over were significant. The isolation was absolute. No visitors would arrive. No mail would come except messages via radio, and those were often delayed and limited. The small group of men lived in extremely close quarters with no escape from each other. Personality conflicts that might have been minor annoyances in normal life could escalate into serious tensions when there was nowhere to go to get away. The Navy had screened candidates for winter over positions carefully, looking for psychological stability and the ability to work in teams, but even careful screening couldn't prevent all problems. Most stations established informal protocols to manage tensions, assigning men to different work shifts if they didn't get along, creating quiet spaces where someone could be alone for a while, and encouraging hobbies and individual projects to give people outlets. The darkness itself wore on some men more than others. At McMurdo Station, because it's at 77 degrees south latitude rather than at the pole itself, the sun dips below the horizon in late April and doesn't reappear until late August. That's for months of continuous night, though there are hours of twilight each day when the sun is just below the horizon and some dim light filters across the sky. At the South Pole, the sun sets in late March and doesn't rise again until late September, 6 full months of darkness. The human body is wired to respond to day and night cycles, and the absence of that cycle disrupts sleep patterns, mood, and energy levels. Some men developed sleep problems, lying awake during the designated night hours even though they were exhausted, then fighting to stay awake during work hours. Others found themselves sleeping too much, retreating into sleep as an escape from the unchanging darkness outside. But the darkness brought its own strange beauty. The aurora australis, the southern lights, danced across the winter sky on many nights when geomagnetic activity was high. Curtains of light, green and red and sometimes purple, shimmered and rippled overhead, driven by interactions between solar particles and the upper atmosphere. The displays could last for hours, constantly changing, folding and unfolding. Men would stand outside in temperatures far below zero, necks craned back, watching the lights dance. The stars were spectacular, visible with a clarity impossible in most other places on Earth because the air was so cold and dry and there was no light pollution for thousands of miles. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Constellations invisible from northern latitudes were overhead every night. The Southern Cross, the clouds of Magellan, countless stars with no names. On nights when the moon was up, it cast a strange pale light across the ice, creating landscapes of shadows and highlights that seemed otherworldly. The scientific work gave purpose and structure to the winter-over experience. The men weren't just enduring the winter for the sake of endurance, they were there to keep the observations going, to collect data that would contribute to understanding the planet. When a major storm system moved through and the meteorologist was outside in howling winds recording observations, he knew that data was being radioed to forecasting centers where it would help predict weather across the South Pacific. When the seismologist discovered on his morning check that the seismograph had recorded a major earthquake on the other side of the world, he could calculate the magnitude and location, contributing to the global effort to understand earthquakes. This sense of purpose, of contributing to something larger than themselves, sustained many men through the difficult winter months. The technology available to scientists in the 1950s seems primitive by modern standards. There were no computers at the Antarctic stations, no laptops, or even electronic calculators. Complex calculations were done with slide rules or mechanical calculating machines that clattered and clanked as their gears turned. Data was recorded on paper, handwritten logbooks filled with careful notations, or on strip charts where pens traced lines on slowly moving rolls of paper. The seismographs used rotating drums covered with smoked paper, and a stylus scratched away the smoke to reveal the seismic waves. At the end of each day, the operator had to carefully remove the paper record, label it with a date and time, and file it away with thousands of other records. All of this data would eventually be shipped back to universities and research institutions where it would be manually transcribed and analyzed. Radio communication was the only link to the outside world, and it was unreliable. Shortwave radio signals bounce off the ionosphere, allowing them to travel thousands of miles around the curvature of the Earth. But the ionosphere is constantly changing, affected by solar activity, time of day, and geomagnetic conditions. Sometimes the radio link would be crystal clear, voices coming through as if the other person was in the next room. Other times, especially during magnetic storms, the signal would fade in and out, overwhelmed by static and noise. Radio operators developed the skill to decipher messages under terrible conditions, listening intently through the crackle and hiss, copying down messages one word at a time. All radio traffic was in Morse code or voice, and conversations had to be brief because other stations were waiting to use the same frequencies. The equipment used to build and maintain these stations represented the cutting edge of cold weather technology. The massive Caterpillar D8 tractors that hauled supplies across the ice had been specially modified. The standard D8 had its frame extended by 4 feet to accommodate wider tracks, 54-inch tracks instead of the standard narrower ones. These wider tracks distributed the weight over a larger area, reducing ground pressure to about 4.3 pounds per square inch, allowing the tractors to cross snow bridges over crevasses without breaking through. The blades were extended too, reaching widths of 18.5 feet, able to push enormous amounts of snow when building roads or clearing areas for construction. The engines were equipped with special heaters that kept coolant and oil from freezing when the tractors were shut down. Starting a cold engine in Antarctic conditions was a serious challenge. The oil thickened to molasses consistency, the diesel fuel wanted to gel, batteries lost most of their power. Preheating the engine with portable heaters for an hour or more before attempting to start it was standard procedure. Aircraft operations in Antarctica pushed the limits of what was possible with 1950s aviation technology. The workhorse aircraft for moving personnel and light cargo was the Douglas R-4D, the Navy's version of the famous DC-3. These aircraft were fitted with skis instead of wheels, massive steel skis that allowed them to land on snow-covered ice instead of needing a prepared runway. The skis had to be specially designed to handle the stresses of landing and taking off in soft snow or hard ice, and they added weight and drag that reduced the aircraft's range and carrying capacity. Pilots learned to judge snow conditions by sight and feel, looking for the subtle variations in surface texture that indicated whether the snow would support the aircraft's weight or whether the skis would punch through into softer layers beneath. For heavy cargo, the larger C-124 Globemaster aircraft were used, but these had to operate from prepared runways, landing on wheels. McMurdo Station developed an ice runway on the sea ice near the station, carefully prepared by grading the surface and monitoring ice thickness to ensure it could support the weight of these massive aircraft. The runway had to be rebuilt each year after the sea ice broke up, and it was only usable during certain months when temperatures were cold enough to keep the ice solid but warm enough that engines and hydraulic systems would function. The icebreaker ships that kept the supply routes open were marvels of specialized engineering. USS Glacier, commissioned in 1955, was the largest and most powerful icebreaker in the U.S. Navy at that time. She displaced more than 8,000 tons fully loaded and was 310 feet long. Her bow was massively reinforced with extra thick steel plating and internal frames designed to absorb the shock of ramming into ice. The hull had a special rounded shape underwater that caused the ship to ride up onto the ice rather than trying to push through it, using the ship's weight to crack the ice from above. Her engines produced 21,000 horsepower, turning large propellers that could be reversed instantly to back the ship away from ice and then ram forward again. Breaking through thick ice was slow, brutal work. The ship would back up, then charge forward, engines roaring, striking the ice with tremendous force. If the ice didn't break on the first ram, they'd back up and try again, sometimes needing dozens of attempts to break through a particularly thick section. Progress through heavy pack ice might be only a mile or two per day. Life aboard the icebreakers during Antarctic deployment was demanding. The ships rolled heavily in the rough Southern Ocean seas during the transit south. Once in the ice, the constant ramming created tremendous vibrations throughout the vessel, with the banging and crashing of ice making sleep difficult. The crews worked long hours because daylight was continuous during summer and the short operating season meant every day counted. But they also took pride in their work, knowing that their efforts opening the channel through the ice were making the entire Antarctic operation possible. The International Geophysical Year's scientific observations created an unprecedented dataset about Antarctica and the planet as a whole. The meteorological records revealed patterns in Antarctic weather that had only been guessed at before. Scientists could track how low-pressure systems formed over the southern oceans and moved south toward Antarctica, bringing storms that battered the coastal stations. They observed the katabatic winds that form over the high interior ice sheet, cold heavy air flowing downslope toward the coast and accelerating to hurricane force in some locations. They documented temperature inversions where the air at ground level was far colder than the air a few hundred feet up, a phenomenon caused by the ice sheet radiating heat away into space while the air above remained relatively warm. The seismic data collected during the IGY contributed to revolutionary advances in understanding Earth's interior structure. By the late 1950s, seismologists had confirmed the existence of distinct layers within the planet: the solid inner core, the liquid outer core where Earth's magnetic field is generated, the thick mantle, and the thin crust. They were beginning to understand that the crust itself was broken into moving plates, though the theory of plate tectonics wouldn't be fully developed until the 1960s. Antarctic seismometers played a crucial role in this work because they were positioned in unique locations, allowing triangulation of earthquake epicenters that wouldn't have been possible with Northern Hemisphere stations alone. The cosmic ray measurements taken at Antarctic stations contributed to understanding how solar activity affected the Earth. Cosmic rays are high-energy particles, mostly protons, that stream through space from sources both within our galaxy and beyond. When these particles strike Earth's atmosphere, they create cascades of secondary particles that shower down toward the surface. The intensity of cosmic rays reaching ground level varies with solar activity because the Sun's magnetic field deflects some of the cosmic rays. During periods of high solar activity, fewer cosmic rays reach Earth. During solar minimum, cosmic ray intensity increases. Tracking these variations helped scientists understand the 11-year solar cycle and the structure of the Sun's magnetic field extending out through the solar system. The ice cores drilled during the IGY were relatively shallow by later standards, but they proved the concept that ice cores could be used as climate archives. Scientists identified annual layers in the cores, visible as slight variations in crystal structure and impurities. They measured the oxygen isotope ratios, finding that these ratios varied from layer to layer in ways that corresponded to temperature changes. Layers deposited during colder periods had different isotope signatures than layers from warmer periods. This meant that by carefully analyzing ice cores, researchers could reconstruct past temperatures going back decades or centuries, or potentially much longer if they could drill deep enough. The implications were profound. Antarctica's ice sheets contained a record of Earth's climate history, frozen in place, waiting to be read. The discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts from satellite observations, combined with ground-based observations of auroral activity and magnetic field variations from Antarctic stations, revealed that Earth exists within a complex environment of magnetic fields and charged particles. The Sun constantly streams particles outward in the solar wind. Earth's magnetic field acts as a shield, deflecting most of these particles around the planet. But some particles get trapped, spiraling back and forth between the magnetic poles along field lines, creating the radiation belts. During magnetic storms, when solar activity increases, more particles are injected into the belts and some particles precipitate down into the upper atmosphere, colliding with oxygen and nitrogen atoms and causing them to glow, creating the aurora. Antarctic observers could watch the aurora dancing overhead and know they were seeing visible evidence of invisible magnetic forces and particle streams extending thousands of miles into space. The human dimensions of the International Geophysical Year operations were as significant as the scientific achievements. In the winter of 1957, there were approximately 80 Americans wintering over at the 7 U.S. Antarctic stations. At the peak of summer operations, more than 200 Americans were working on the continent, plus hundreds more on ships and aircraft supporting the operation. When you added the personnel from all the other nations' operating stations, the total number of people working in Antarctica during the IGY exceeded 1,000, an astonishing concentration of scientific and support activity in a place that had been virtually empty of human presence just a few years earlier. These were mostly young men, in their 20s and early 30s, drawn from diverse backgrounds. The military provided much of the support personnel: Navy Seabees, radio operators, pilots, medical corpsmen, cooks, mechanics. The scientists came from universities and research institutions, some already established in their fields, others early in their careers, seeing Antarctica as an adventure and an opportunity to make significant contributions. Many had volunteered for Antarctic duty, attracted by the challenge and the opportunity to be part of something historic. Others had been assigned, ordered to Antarctica as part of their military service, though even those who hadn't volunteered often found the experience meaningful. Living conditions varied considerably from station to station, but none of the stations offered much comfort by normal standards. Dormitories were crowded, with bunks arranged in double or triple tiers to maximize use of limited space. Privacy was almost non-existent. Men slept, dressed, and lived within a few feet of each other for months. Personal possessions had to be kept to a minimum because there simply wasn't space for much beyond essential clothing and perhaps a few books or photographs from home. Communal bathrooms served everyone, and with limited water available, bathing was strictly controlled. At some stations, men might get a shower once or twice a week, with strict time limits. The rest of the time, they washed from basins with small amounts of water. Water itself was a precious resource. Some stations melted ice or snow for all their water needs, running the snow through specialized melters that produced lukewarm water at a slow rate. The process consumed large amounts of fuel, and the resulting water often had a flat, peculiar taste. Other stations had equipment to distill seawater, but this too required considerable energy. Water conservation became second nature, learning to wash with minimal water, to reuse water when possible, to never waste a drop. The food was adequate in calories but monotonous and often unappetizing. Canned vegetables dominated the menu, corn and peas and green beans that had been processed months or even years earlier and shipped halfway around the world. Meat came from cans too, spam and canned ham and corned beef. Powdered milk reconstituted into a thin liquid that bore only passing resemblance to real milk. Powdered eggs scrambled into rubbery yellow masses. Bread was baked fresh on station, one of the few bright spots in the menu, and a good cook could make a real difference in morale by varying the preparations and occasionally producing something special from the limited ingredients available. Holiday meals were events that the cooks prepared for weeks in advance, saving back special ingredients, planning elaborate menus. Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners featured turkey, though from cans, and attempts at traditional side dishes and desserts. These meals became the highlights of the long winter, bringing the crew together for feasting and celebration that temporarily broke the routine. The psychological toll of isolation and confinement emerged in various ways. Some men withdrew into themselves, becoming quiet and introspective, spending their free time alone reading or listening to music on the station's limited record collection. Others became more talkative, perhaps too talkative, dominating conversations and wearing on their crewmates' patience. Small irritations became magnified. Someone's habit of slurping coffee or humming while they worked could drive others to irrational anger. The Navy had trained officers and senior enlisted men to watch for signs of serious psychological problems, depression or anxiety or paranoia, but minor personality conflicts were considered normal and manageable as long as they didn't escalate into violence or complete breakdowns. The constant darkness of the Antarctic winter affected circadian rhythms and sleep patterns in ways that researchers were only beginning to understand. The human body has internal clocks that regulate sleep and wakefulness, body temperature, hormone release, and many other functions on roughly 24-hour cycles. These clocks are normally synchronized to the day-night cycle by exposure to sunlight. In the absence of that natural light cycle, the internal clocks can drift out of synchronization, causing sleep disorders, mood changes, and reduced cognitive performance. Men at Antarctic stations often reported difficulty sleeping, lying awake for hours despite being exhausted, or alternatively sleeping too much, finding it hard to get out of bed even after sleeping 10 or 12 hours. The station schedules tried to maintain normal day-night routines with artificial lighting, dimming lights during designated nighttime hours, but it wasn't the same as real daylight. Yet despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, many men found the Antarctic experience profoundly meaningful. There was something about being in such an extreme environment, so far from civilization, that stripped away the trivial concerns of normal life and focused attention on what mattered: doing your job well, looking out for your crewmates, contributing to the mission. The small crews developed intense bonds, trust and camaraderie forged through shared hardship. They depended on each other absolutely, knowing that mistakes could have serious consequences and that everyone had to pull their weight. Stories from Antarctic winters are filled with accounts of men going far beyond their assigned duties to help others: the mechanic who spent all night fixing the generator when it broke down in the middle of winter, the cook who baked a birthday cake from scratch to surprise a crew member, the station chief who mediated conflicts and kept morale up through personal attention and humor. The beauty of Antarctica itself left lasting impressions on almost everyone who spent time there. The vast emptiness, the enormous scale of the ice sheet stretching to every horizon, created a sense of humility and wonder. The colors were subtle but striking, endless variations of white and blue and gray, the ice taking on different hues depending on light and weather. Clouds could create spectacular displays, lenticular clouds forming smooth lens shapes in the wind, or storm clouds boiling up with dark bottoms and towering heights. The light itself was strange and magical, especially during the transition seasons of autumn and spring when the sun grazed along the horizon for weeks, creating long twilights of orange and pink and purple spreading across the sky. Many men took up photography, carrying cameras despite the challenges of operating them in extreme cold where film became brittle and mechanisms froze. The construction of the bases and the logistics of keeping them supplied represented engineering and organizational achievements that matched the scientific accomplishments in their own way. Consider what it took to keep one station operational for a year. You needed food for every person for 365 days, meaning thousands of pounds of canned goods, flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples had to be stockpiled. You needed fuel for generators, heating, vehicles, and cooking, often hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel or aviation fuel. You needed spare parts for every piece of equipment because nothing could be ordered from a supply depot if something broke. You needed medical supplies sufficient to handle anything from minor cuts to major trauma or illness. You needed clothing, bedding, cleaning supplies, office supplies, scientific instruments and consumables like recording paper and chemicals. All of this had to be assembled, packed, shipped thousands of miles by sea, offloaded through pack ice or at difficult sites, then transported to the station location and stored in a way that protected it from extreme cold and moisture. The Navy's logistics operation developed into a finely tuned system over the years of deep freeze operations. Detailed inventories tracked every item at every station. Requisitions for the next summer's supplies had to be submitted by winter over cruise by certain deadlines so that materials could be procured and shipped. Specialized containers were developed that could withstand rough handling and extreme conditions. Everything was labeled and packed in ways that made it possible to find what you needed among thousands of boxes and crates. Loading plans for ships and aircraft were carefully worked out to balance weight and to ensure that priority items were accessible. The logistics personnel who managed these operations never got the recognition that the scientists and explorers received, but without their meticulous work, nothing else would have been possible. Operation Deep Freeze continued year after the official International Geophysical Year ended. The infrastructure was in place, the commitment had been made, and the scientific value of maintaining long-term observations was clear. Each year was numbered sequentially, Deep Freeze 60, Deep Freeze 61, continuing through the decades. Admiral Byrd died on March 11, 1957, in his sleep in Boston, before the full scope of Operation Deep Freeze was completed. He had lived to see the first permanent stations established and the beginning of the IGY observations, but he didn't live to see the full scientific results or the Antarctic Treaty that his advocacy had helped make possible. Admiral Dufek, who had led the initial operations and wintered over at McMurdo, continued as the key figure in U.S. Antarctic operations for several more years, though operational command of McMurdo Station changed hands on November 28, 1957 when the first winter was complete and new commanders rotated in. Some of the stations established during the IGY had relatively short operational lives. Ellsworth Station's difficult location and resupply challenges led to its closure after just a few years. Wilkes Station was transferred to Australia in 1959, becoming an Australian research station. Byrd Station operated continuously until 1972, then intermittently until it was finally closed in the early 2000s as more modern facilities replaced it. Hallett Station operated as a joint US-New Zealand facility until 1973 when it too was closed, partly for environmental reasons as awareness grew about the impact of human presence on the penguin colony. Little America 5 was abandoned when it became clear the ice it sat on was unstable, and its eventual departure to sea aboard an iceberg became an unexpected footnote in Antarctic history. But McMurdo Station and the South Pole Station continued to grow and develop. McMurdo became the logistics hub for all U.S. Antarctic operations, expanding from the initial handful of buildings to a sprawling complex that resembled a small industrial town. By the 1960s, summer populations at McMurdo reached several hundred people. Large warehouses stored supplies and equipment. Maintenance facilities serviced vehicles and aircraft. The station grew to include a hospital, a power plant, fuel storage facilities, dormitories, a galley that could serve hundreds of meals per day, laboratories, communication centers, and administrative offices. At its peak in summer, modern McMurdo Station hosts more than 1,000 people, making it by far the largest settlement in Antarctica. The South Pole Station was rebuilt twice after the original station established in 1957. The first replacement was completed in 1975, a distinctive geodesic aluminum dome 50 feet high and 164 feet in diameter, constructed by the Navy's Mobile Construction Battalion 71. This dome protected the buildings inside from snow drift and wind while creating a large covered work area. But even the dome eventually became buried by accumulating snow, and the buildings inside suffered from aging and inefficiency. A new elevated station was completed and commissioned on January 12, 2008, built on stilts that can be jacked up as snow accumulates beneath, designed to last for decades without being buried. Technological improvements transformed Antarctic operations over the decades following the IGY. A nuclear power reactor, the PM-3A, was installed at McMurdo Station in 1962, providing reliable electrical power and heat without the constant need for fuel deliveries. It operated for 10 years until 1972, when it was shut down and eventually removed, the only nuclear power plant ever operated in Antarctica. Satellite communications replaced the unreliable shortwave radio links, providing reliable voice, data, and eventually internet connectivity to the stations. Modern vehicles replaced the old D8 tractors, though many of the same engineering principles still applied: wide tracks, low ground pressure, powerful engines. Wind turbines were installed at some stations to supplement diesel generators with renewable energy. Waste management systems became far more sophisticated as environmental awareness increased, with strict protocols for handling sewage, trash, and hazardous materials rather than the early practices of simply dumping waste onto the ice or into the ocean. In 1999, the U.S. Air Force turned over responsibility for airlift operations in Antarctica to the Air National Guard's 109th Airlift Wing, a unit based in Scotia, New York that specializes in ski-equipped LC-130 Hercules aircraft. These modern aircraft can carry far heavier loads than the older 4DS and can reach any station on the continent. Their modern navigation systems and weather radar make flying in Antarctic conditions much safer than it was in the 1950s, though it still requires specialized training and significant skill. The tradition of Navy support continued through the transition, with Seabees and other Navy personnel still playing key roles in construction and maintenance, but the overall management shifted increasingly towards civilian contractors working under National Science Foundation direction. The United States currently maintains 3 year-round research stations in Antarctica. McMurdo on Ross Island and the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station continue from the IGY era, while Palmer Station on the Antarctic Peninsula was established in 1968 to focus on marine and biological research in a more moderate coastal environment. These stations host hundreds of scientists each year conducting research across the full spectrum of disciplines that Antarctica makes possible. Modern Antarctic research has expanded far beyond the observations that dominated the IGY. Climate change studies use ice cores drilled to depths of more than 2 miles, retrieving ice that fell as snow 800,000 years ago. The chemical and isotopic analysis of these cores has revealed detailed records of past climate variations, showing how temperature, atmospheric carbon dioxide, and other factors have changed through multiple ice ages and warm periods. This paleoclimate data is fundamental to understanding current climate change and predicting future trends. The ice sheets themselves are intensely studied, with satellites monitoring their thickness and flow velocities, ground-based sensors measuring temperature and strain rates, and complex computer models simulating their behavior under different climate scenarios. Understanding whether the Antarctic ice sheets are stable or might collapse and raise global sea levels is one of the most important questions in climate science. Ecosystem research has revealed that Antarctica, despite its harsh conditions, hosts remarkable biodiversity and biological adaptations. In the ocean waters around Antarctica, researchers study fish species that survive in water cold enough to freeze them solid, protected by antifreeze proteins in their blood. They investigate massive populations of krill, small crustaceans that form the base of the Antarctic food web, supporting whales, seals, penguins, and countless other species. On land, scientists study microorganisms living in the most extreme environments, bacteria and fungi surviving in rocks, in frozen soil, in lakes buried beneath hundreds of meters of ice. These organisms provide insights into the limits of life and offer potential analogues for what life might be like on other worlds with extreme conditions. Astronomy and astrophysics research has flourished at Antarctic locations, particularly at the South Pole, where the cold, dry air and months of continuous darkness provide exceptional observing conditions. The South Pole Telescope, a 10-meter diameter instrument, maps the cosmic microwave background radiation, studying the subtle patterns that reveal information about the first moments after the Big Bang. The IceCube Neutrino Observatory, completed in 2010, consists of thousands of sensors buried deep in the ice detecting neutrinos, nearly massless particles that stream through matter almost unimpeded. By studying neutrinos from distant cosmic events, scientists probe some of the most violent and energetic processes in the universe: supernova explosions, black hole accretion, and phenomena we haven't yet fully explained. The legacy of Operation Deep Freeze and the International Geophysical Year extends far beyond the immediate scientific results. The 200 Seabees who formed the first winter-over crew at McMurdo Station in 1956, the pilots who flew supplies to the South Pole in the Antarctic night, the scientists who maintained observations through storms and cold and isolation, all these people were doing something unprecedented. They were proving that permanent human presence in Antarctica was possible, not just for brief exploring expeditions but for sustained operations year after year. They were demonstrating that the harsh environment could be managed, that with proper planning, adequate equipment, and skilled personnel, bases could be built and maintained safely. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They weren't superhuman. They were well-trained, well-equipped, well-led, and deeply committed to their mission. They made Antarctica accessible in ways that earlier explorers could only dream about. When Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen ventured south in the early 1900s, they faced starvation, frostbite, death from cold and exhaustion. 50 years later, men were living in heated buildings, eating regular meals, conducting complex scientific research. The transformation was remarkable, enabled by technology but requiring human courage and determination. The international cooperation established during the IGY laid the groundwork for the Antarctic Treaty, signed on December 1, 1959 in Washington, D.C. by 12 original signatories. These nations, Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, agreed to revolutionary provisions. They set aside all territorial claims to Antarctica, agreeing that the continent would not be owned by any nation. They banned military activity, prohibiting bases, weapons testing, and military maneuvers. They banned nuclear explosions and nuclear waste disposal. They established Antarctica as a scientific preserve, with freedom of scientific investigation and cooperation as fundamental principles. They agreed to share data openly and to allow inspections of each other's stations to verify compliance. The treaty entered into force on June 23, 1961 and has been remarkably successful and durable. It was the first arms control agreement of the Cold War era, demonstrating that the United States and Soviet Union could cooperate on significant issues despite their broader confrontation. As of 2024, 58 nations are parties to the treaty, including all the world's major powers and most nations with interests in Antarctic research. Additional agreements have been added over the decades to strengthen environmental protections. The Madrid Protocol, signed in 1991 and entering into force in 1998, banned all mineral mining in Antarctica indefinitely and established comprehensive environmental impact assessment requirements for all activities on the continent. The Antarctic Treaty stands as proof that international cooperation on the basis of shared scientific goals can overcome political divisions. It created a unique governance system where no single nation controls territory but all participating nations share responsibility for protecting the environment and facilitating research. The model has occasionally been discussed as a potential framework for governing other areas of common human interest, though it has never been successfully replicated. The story of Operation Deep Freeze and the bases built during that intense period of activity in the 1950s is ultimately a story about human capability and determination. It's about what becomes possible when people commit to a goal and work systematically to achieve it despite obstacles. Antarctica didn't become easier or less dangerous because people decided to build permanent stations there. The cold remained just as extreme, the storms just as violent, the isolation just as profound. What changed was human capability, developing technologies and techniques that made it possible to live and work in that environment safely and productively. Every winter when a new crew settles in at McMurdo or South Pole or Palmer Station, watching the last aircraft depart and knowing they're committed for the next 6 or 8 months, they're following in the footsteps of those first winter-over crews from 1956 and 1957. The buildings are more comfortable now, the food is better, communications are reliable, but the fundamental experience remains. The isolation, the dependence on crewmates, the importance of every person doing their job well, the spectacular beauty of the landscape, the privilege of contributing to scientific understanding, these things haven't changed. Antarctica demands respect and attention and care, but it rewards those who come with purpose and commitment. The ice endures. Antarctica's vast ice sheets continue their slow flow toward the sea, just as they have for millions of years. Glaciers grind forward, carving valleys and depositing moraines. Icebergs carve from ice shelves and drift northward until they melt in warmer waters. Snow falls on the high plateau, accumulating layer by layer, compressing under its own weight into ice that will flow eventually to the coast. The cycle continues, indifferent to human presence. The scientific stations scattered across the continent are tiny pinpricks of light and warmth in a cold white immensity. They exist because people choose to make them exist, because each year new crews arrive with supplies and determination to maintain the presence established decades ago. The story continues. Every austral summer, ships and aircraft converge on Antarctica, bringing supplies and personnel for another season. Construction projects expand facilities or build new ones. Scientists arrive to conduct their research projects, gathering data that will contribute to dissertations and papers and eventually to broader understanding. When winter arrives and most people leave, the winter-over crews remain, keeping the lights on, maintaining the observations, waiting for spring. In the pre-dawn twilight of an Antarctic spring morning, when the first hint of sun appears on the northern horizon after months of darkness, there's a sense of renewal, of cycles continuing, of persistence rewarded. The knowledge gained from Antarctic research has transformed our understanding of Earth's climate system, past and present and potentially future. The discovery of the ozone hole over Antarctica in the 1980s led to international action to ban the chemicals causing it, an environmental success story enabled by Antarctic observations. The climate records extracted from ice cores provide context for current warming trends, showing how unusual the recent rapid temperature changes are compared to natural variations over the past hundreds of thousands of years. The studies of how ice sheets respond to warming oceans and atmosphere inform predictions about sea level rise. Antarctica is a laboratory where Earth systems can be studied in conditions that exist nowhere else. But beyond the scientific results and the data sets and the papers published, the story of Operation Deep Freeze represents something fundamental about human nature. We are explorers and investigators, driven to go to difficult places and figure out how to survive there and study what we find. Antarctica called to explorers for centuries, mysterious and dangerous and fascinating. The heroic age of exploration in the early 20th century saw men travel to Antarctica in wooden ships, sledging across the ice with dogs and their own muscle power, some dying in the attempt, others returning with stories of survival against terrible odds. Operation Deep Freeze continued that tradition but transformed the scale and the sustainability. It made Antarctica accessible not just to a handful of explorers but to hundreds of scientists and support personnel, year after year, building on what came before. If you've enjoyed this journey through the history of Operation Deep Freeze and the construction of humanity's first permanent bases in Antarctica, learning about the challenges faced and overcome, the scientific achievements, the international cooperation, and the individual stories of commitment and endurance, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleep Orion. Your support helps me continue creating these long-form explorations of human achievement and discovery. Share your thoughts in the comments about this remarkable chapter of exploration history, whether you found the logistics fascinating or the science compelling or simply enjoyed drifting off while learning about Antarctica's frozen landscapes. Each like and subscription helps more people find these stories and supports the research and writing that goes into creating them. Thank you for listening, and rest well knowing that even in the coldest, most isolated place on Earth, human curiosity and cooperation have created something remarkable and enduring.